Two bodies, one inside the house, the other sitting in a car outside, both executed. No sign of forced entry, no weapon, no witnesses. For 25 years. This case made no sense. Until investigators uncovered something chilling, the killer had been close the entire time. Welcome to Condemned Files. In today's case, we're looking at one of Michigan's most disturbing cold cases, the murders of Rick and Gail Brink. Before we get into it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's get into it. Two bodies were discovered on the morning of November 23, 1987, in Park Township, Ottawa County, Michigan. One was inside the home. The other was in a vehicle parked outside. Both had been shot. According to investigators, the scene immediately suggested something deliberate. This was not a random act, and it was not a burglary gone wrong. There were no signs of forced entry, no immediate evidence of a struggle, and no indication that anything had been taken. The man found in the vehicle was Rick Brink, 28 years old. Inside the home was his wife, Gail Brink, 22. They had returned home the night before after attending a wedding. What happened between their arrival and the discovery the next morning was unknown. There were no witnesses, no clear sequence of events, and no obvious explanation. For investigators, the case began not with answers, but with a scene that raised more questions than it could explain. And those questions would remain for decades. Rick Brink was 28 years old. Gail Brink was 22. They were a young married couple living in Park Township, near Holland, Michigan. They had been married for just over a year, still in the early stage of building a life together. Their home represented a beginning, routine, stability, and plans that were still taking shape. According to people who knew them, there was nothing about their lives that suggested danger. They were described as quiet, ordinary, and focused on their future. There were no widely known disputes, no reported threats, and no indication that either of them was involved in anything that would draw attention. Investigators looked closely at their background, searching for anything that could explain what had happened. They examined relationships, work life, and family connections. But nothing immediately stood out. There was no clear reason why Rick and Gail Brink would be targeted, and that absence became one of the most troubling aspects of the case. Because when there is no visible motive, the question becomes even harder to answer. On November 22, 1987, Rick and Gail Brink attended a wedding. It was a normal evening by all available accounts. A social gathering filled with familiar faces, conversation, and the kind of atmosphere that comes with celebration. There was nothing unusual reported about their behavior that night, and nothing to suggest they were in danger. They stayed for several hours before eventually leaving. At some point later that night, they returned home to Park Township. The exact time of their arrival was never firmly established, but investigators were able to confirm that they made it back without incident. No one reported seeing them followed. No suspicious activity was noted near the home. From everything that could be reconstructed, the night appeared ordinary. But what happened after they arrived inside remains unclear. There were no witnesses to what followed, no confirmed timeline of events inside the house, only the outcome. And that outcome would force investigators to work backward, trying to understand how a routine evening ended in something deliberate and irreversible. Rick Brink was found in his vehicle, parked in the driveway outside the home. He had been shot. According to investigators, his position inside the vehicle suggested that whatever happened occurred either just as he arrived or before he had the chance to leave again. There were no indications of a prolonged struggle inside the car, and no signs that the vehicle had been moved after the incident. The scene appeared controlled. There was no visible damage to the vehicle that would suggest forced entry or confrontation from the outside. No broken glass. No signs of panic. It raised a question investigators would return to repeatedly. Did Rick know the person responsible? Because the absence of chaos suggested something else, that the encounter may not have started as a threat. There were no witnesses who reported hearing anything unusual that night, no confirmed sounds of gunfire that could be tied directly to the moment of the crime. And as investigators examined the scene further, one detail became clear. This was not an impulsive act. The positioning, the lack of disturbance, and the precision of the attack all pointed in one direction. Whoever did this had control of the situation from the very beginning. Inside the home, investigators found Gail Brink. She had been shot multiple times. The location of her body indicated that the attack occurred within the house, separate from where Rick had been found. The distance between the two scenes created an immediate problem for investigators. It suggested movement, a sequence of events that had to be reconstructed without witnesses. According to investigators, there were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the home. Doors and windows were intact. There was no evidence of a break-in, and no indication that someone had forced their way inside. The interior of the house did not show signs of a violent struggle. Nothing appeared overturned. Nothing suggested chaos or panic. This raised a critical question. If there was no forced entry, how did the person responsible get inside? One possibility stood out, that the person was either let in or already known to them. Investigators could not immediately confirm how the sequence unfolded between Rick outside and Gail inside. But one thing was clear. The events were connected, and whoever was responsible had moved between both scenes, with purpose. As investigators processed both scenes, a pattern began to emerge, not from what was present, but from what was missing. There was no murder weapon recovered. Despite a thorough search of the property and surrounding area, nothing was found that could be directly linked to the shootings. According to case records, there were also no shell casings discovered at either scene. That detail mattered. In many cases involving firearms, shell casings provide critical evidence, location, movement, even potential links to a specific weapon. But here, there was nothing. This absence suggested two possibilities. Either the weapon used did not eject casings, or whoever committed the crime had taken steps to remove them. Both scenarios pointed to a level of awareness. Investigators also noted the lack of physical evidence connecting any individual to the scene. No fingerprints of value, no clear trace evidence that could immediately identify a suspect. Without those elements, the case faced a serious limitation, because without physical evidence, there was nothing to anchor the investigation to a specific person. And without that anchor, the case remained suspended in uncertainty, with no clear direction forward. The Ottawa County Sheriff's Office began a full investigation immediately after the discovery. Detectives started with the people closest to Rick and Gail Brink, family members, friends, co-workers, anyone who might have insight into their lives or movements leading up to that night. Interviews were conducted and timelines were carefully constructed. Investigators worked to determine who had last seen the couple, what they had done in the days before the murders, and whether anything had seemed out of place. According to investigators, the process was thorough, but it did not produce a clear suspect. No one reported threats. No one described unusual behavior. No one provided information that pointed directly to a motive. Even those closest to the couple could not explain why they would be targeted. Investigators also examined extended connections, acquaintances, social circles, and any individuals who may have had indirect contact with Rick and Gail. Still, nothing stood out. Each lead that appeared promising eventually reached a dead end, and as the investigation continued, a pattern began to take shape. There was information, but none of it connected in a way that explained the crime. As the investigation continued, one issue became increasingly difficult to ignore. There was no clear motive. According to investigators, there was no evidence of robbery. Nothing significant appeared to be missing from the home. There were no financial disputes that immediately stood out, and no indication that the couple had been targeted for material reasons. There was also no confirmed history of conflict that could explain a personal attack. No ongoing disputes, no reported threats, no signs of escalating tension in their lives. In many homicide cases, motive provides direction. It helps narrow the focus, identify possible suspects, and build a timeline around intent. But in this case, that direction was missing. Investigators were left with a crime that appeared deliberate, but without an explanation for why it had happened. That absence created a gap in the investigation, because without motive, every possibility had to be considered. And when every possibility is open, it becomes significantly harder to identify the one that is true. In the absence of a clear motive, investigators expanded their focus. They pursued every lead available, no matter how small. Tips were followed, statements were rechecked. Individuals connected to the couple, even indirectly, were looked at more closely. According to investigators, several possibilities were considered during the early stages of the case. Some theories suggested the involvement of unknown individuals. Others explored whether the crime could have been connected to people outside the couple's immediate circle. But none of these directions produced solid evidence. Each lead required time and resources, yet each one eventually reached the same outcome. No confirmation, no connection, no suspect. Our investigators were working with fragments, pieces of information that did not align into a clear picture. And without physical evidence to support those leads, it became increasingly difficult to move forward with confidence. As time passed, the investigation continued, but the distance between the crime and the truth remained unchanged. As the investigation moved forward, progress became harder to sustain. Weeks turned into months, and the initial urgency began to fade. According to investigators, the lack of physical evidence continued to limit what could be done. Without a weapon, without witnesses, and without a clear suspect, there were no new directions to pursue. The case remained open, but active leads had been exhausted. Interviews had been conducted. Timelines had been reviewed. Possible connections had been explored, and yet none of it produced a breakthrough. Over time, attention shifted to other cases, those with stronger evidence, clearer leads, and a higher likelihood of resolution. Rick and Gail Brink's case did not disappear, but it was no longer moving forward. It became something else, a file that remained unsolved, a case without answers. And as time passed, the possibility of finding those answers began to feel more distant. Time moved forward, but the case did not. Years passed without significant developments. What had once been an active investigation gradually became a long-standing mystery within the community. The details remained the same, the questions unanswered, and the lack of evidence unchanged. According to investigators, there were no major breakthroughs during this period. No new witnesses came forward, and no discoveries shifted the direction of the case. For the families involved, the passage of time did not bring resolution. The case remained open, but inactive. As newer investigations took priority, the Brink case settled into a different category, a cold case, one that carried the weight of unanswered questions and unresolved events. Over time, the circumstances surrounding the murders became more distant, and the possibility of solving the case appeared increasingly uncertain. Because with every passing year, memories fade, details become harder to verify, and the chance of uncovering the truth grows smaller. More than 2 decades after the murders, the case was brought back into focus. Around 2009, efforts to review older unsolved cases began to take shape, and the Brink case was among those selected for re-examination. By 2011, investigators were actively working it again. This time, the approach was different. Instead of relying only on what had been done before, detectives revisited everything from the beginning. Original reports were reviewed. Evidence was reanalyzed, and most importantly, people who had been interviewed years earlier were contacted again. According to investigators, the goal was not just to find new information, but to look at old information differently. Because over time, circumstances change. People's memories shift, relationships evolve, and sometimes individuals are more willing to speak than they were before. Investigators began comparing past statements with new ones, looking for differences, no matter how small. At first, those differences seemed minor, but as the process continued, a pattern began to emerge. Now, some details no longer aligned with what had originally been reported, and for the first time in years, the case showed signs of movement. In 2013, a development shifted the direction of the case. Pam Wingarden, who had been connected to the original investigation, came forward with new information. According to investigators, she stated that the account she gave in 1987 had not been truthful. At the time of the murders, she had provided an alibi for her husband. That alibi had remained part of the case record for years. It had not been successfully challenged during the original investigation. But now, decades later, she said that statement was false. She explained that fear had influenced what she told investigators in 1987. Fear, she said, had shaped her decisions and kept her from revealing what she knew. And her new statement introduced a different version of events, one that directly contradicted what had been accepted for over 20 years. For investigators, this was significant, because when a long-standing alibi is withdrawn, it changes the foundation of the case. It reopens questions that were once considered settled, and it forces investigators to reassess everything that followed. Her statement did not immediately answer every question, but it did something the case had not seen in decades. It created a new direction, one that would lead investigators closer to an answer than they had ever been before. For years, the alibi provided in 1987 had remained unchallenged. It placed her husband away from the scene at the time of the murders, and without evidence to dispute it, investigators had no reason to reject it. According to her 2013 statement, that alibi was not true. She explained that she had intentionally given investigators a version of events that protected her husband. At the time, she said, she believed she had no choice. Fear, she stated, played a central role. Fear of what could happen if she spoke differently. Fear of consequences she believed were immediate and real. Over time, that fear became part of the silence that surrounded the case. For investigators, the implications were significant. A false alibi does more than protect a suspect. It redirects an investigation. It shifts attention away from one person and toward others who may have had no involvement at all. In this case, that redirection lasted for decades, and when the alibi was withdrawn, it forced investigators to reconsider everything connected to it. Because if the original statement was false, then the person it protected could no longer be excluded, and the case itself was no longer what it had once appeared to be. Along with withdrawing the alibi, Pam Wingarden provided additional details that would become central to the case. According to her statement, her husband had admitted responsibility for the murders shortly after they occurred. She told investigators that the admission was made privately, not to authorities, and not in a way that could be immediately verified at the time. She also stated that after the murders, he took her to the location where the crime had occurred. This claim introduced a direct connection between the suspect and the scene. According to her account, she did not report this information in 1987 because she was afraid. And she described that fear as ongoing, something that influenced her actions for years after the event. For investigators, the significance of this statement was clear. It was the first time someone had provided a direct account linking a specific individual to the crime. However, it also raised new questions. because the case now relied heavily on testimony given decades after the fact. There was no physical evidence introduced at that point that independently confirmed the claim, which meant investigators had to evaluate not only what was being said, but also the circumstances under which it was being revealed. The person identified in Pam Wingarden's statement was Ryan Wingarden. He was Gail Brink's brother. Until that point, he had not been charged in connection with the murders. His name existed within the broader scope of the original investigation, but he had not been the focus of it. With the alibi withdrawn and the new statement presented, investigators redirected their attention. According to investigators, they began reviewing his movements, his previous statements, and any connections that could be reevaluated in light of the new information. The shift was significant. What had once been a case without a clear suspect now had a defined direction. But that direction came with challenges, because the case still lacked physical evidence directly tying him to the crime scene. No weapon had been recovered. No forensic link had been established. The case at this stage depended largely on testimony and the reassessment of earlier information. Even so, investigators moved forward. Because for the first time in more than 2 decades, the case was no longer without a suspect. In January 2013, Ryan Wingarden was arrested in connection with the murders of Rick and Gail Brink. After more than 25 years, the case had moved from uncertainty to action. According to investigators, the arrest followed the new statement provided by Pam Wingarden and the subsequent review of earlier evidence and testimony. For the first time since 1987, a suspect was formally charged. The arrest marked a turning point in the case, but it did not resolve the central issue because the case still lacked physical evidence directly linking the suspect to the crime scene. There was no recovered weapon, no forensic match. Instead, the case now depended on whether the available testimony could support a conviction in court. Investigators had reached a conclusion based on the information they had gathered. Now, that conclusion would be tested. The case would move from investigation to prosecution. The trial began in March 2014. Prosecutors presented their case, outlining a sequence of events based largely on testimony and reconstructed timelines. Central to their argument was the statement given by Pam Wingarden, including her claim that her husband had admitted responsibility for the murders. According to prosecutors, the motive involved jealousy and a hidden past relationship, as described through testimony presented in court. The defense challenged these claims. They questioned the reliability of a statement made decades after the event. They argued that memory can change over time and that fear alone did not guarantee accuracy. Without physical evidence, no weapon, no direct forensic link, the case depended heavily on how the jury interpreted the testimony. Witnesses were examined, statements were reviewed, arguments were made from both sides. At the center of everything was one question: was the testimony enough? Because in the absence of physical proof, the outcome would depend on whether the jury believed the account presented to them. On March 28, 2014, the jury reached a decision. Ryan Wingarden was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict brought an end to more than 2 decades of uncertainty. According to court proceedings, the jury accepted the prosecution's case, including the testimony that linked him to the crime. Despite the absence of physical evidence, the statements presented during the trial were considered sufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For the families involved, the decision marked a moment that had been delayed for years. An answer had finally been given. But the nature of that answer reflected the complexity of the case itself. Because the resolution did not come from forensic evidence or from something discovered at the scene, it came from testimony, from information that had not been revealed at the time the crime occurred, and that reality would continue to shape how the case was understood, even after the verdict had been delivered. Following the verdict, Ryan Wingarden was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, he denied responsibility for the murders. According to court reports, he challenged the outcome and disputed the claims made against him. In the years that followed, appeals were filed. Between 2015 and 2018, higher courts reviewed the case. Each time, the conviction was upheld. The courts found no basis to overturn the verdict, and the sentence remained in place. Legally, the case was closed. But its resolution carried a distinction that set it apart from many others. There was no weapon ever recovered, no physical evidence directly tying the accused to the scene. Instead, the case was resolved through testimony, through statements that were not fully revealed until decades after the crime had occurred. For investigators, it marked the end of a long and complex investigation. For those who followed the case, it left a lasting impression, because the truth had not been uncovered through evidence found at the time, but through silence that eventually broke. And for more than 25 years. That silence had kept the answers hidden,